Hey everyone, welcome back to Dre's Crime Chronicles. I'm glad you're here with me because today's story is definitely a heavy one. We're diving into the lives of two brothers, Ronald and James Allridge. Brothers who, despite coming from a loving family, ended up on a path that took them to some of the darkest places you can imagine. They weren't just a couple of bad seeds. This is a story of manipulation, crime, and ultimately capital punishment. It's about one brother who led the other down a tragic path that neither of them could escape from. And here's the thing that really got me about this case. Ronald and James didn't come from a broken home. I'm talking about a family that seemed to have its act together. A father with a solid career in the military, a stable job after retirement, and a mother who loved them dearly. On the outside, it looked like they had everything they needed to grow up just right. But as we'll see, even a loving background isn't always enough to keep someone on the straight and narrow. In this episode, we'll take you through how the Allridge brothers' story began with promise, only to turn into a tale of manipulation and crime that would end in ultimate punishment. We're going to explore the psychological dynamics between Ronald and James, and how one brother's influence played a devastating role in the other's fate. We'll go through the critical moments, like Ronald's first violent crimes, the murder of a classmate, and how their crime spree escalated to multiple murders. Trust me, this is one story you don't want to miss. And just a little side note, personal hook, whatever you want to call this, but what really stuck with me about this case was the emotional complexity behind it. On one hand, you've got a loving family, military roots, and parents who did their best. On the other, you got two brothers who went so far off the rails, it's hard to wrap your head around it. It made me question just how much of our lives are shaped by our choices versus our circumstances. And that's exactly what we're going to explore today. So let's start at the beginning. Ronald and James Allridge were born into what seemed like a stable and supportive home. Their father was a staff sergeant in the U.S. Army, and when James was born on September 27, 1960, the family was stationed in West Germany. It wasn't the easiest life. Military families often deal with a lot of moving around, and what was certainly true for the Allridges. But there was a sense of structure and discipline that came with their dad's career. And in the 1967, the family relocated to Fort Worth, Texas. After Ronald's father retired from the military, he took a job as an HVAC technician, which, if you think about it, is a big shift from the structure of the military to fixing air conditioning in the Texas heat. But it was steady work. It allowed the family to settle down and finally put down some roots after years and years of moving from one base to another. Ronald's mom, Otharie Aldridge, was a loving and supportive figure. She tried to keep the family close-knit, even when the pressure of life and her husband transitioning to civilian work. The Allridges weren't wealthy, but they were comfortable. They were the kind of family that looked after each other. The parents made sure their kids had what they needed, not just the basics, but the kind of support you'd expect from a loving household. They encouraged education, discipline, and respect for others. Now, Ronald was one of two brothers. He was the oldest of the two brothers, and even as a kid, there was something different about him. His parents did their best, but they noticed early that Ronald had a bit of a dark side. He could be charming one minute and then manipulative the next. He had a way of getting under people's skin, of making you feel like you didn't quite know what was going on in his head. His parents, as loving as they were, didn't fully trust him. There was always a sense that he was up to something or up to no good. Now, James, on the other hand, was quieter. He was more reserved. If Ronald was fired, James was the calm water. He was smart. He kept to himself. He didn't get into trouble. At least not at first. But here's where things get complicated. James idolized Ronald. Even when Ronald bullied him or pulled him into schemes, James seemed to crave his older brother's approval. It's like he couldn't see Ronald for who he really was, or just didn't want to. He wanted to be part of whatever Ronald was doing, even if it was taking him down a dangerous road. Now, the signs of Ronald's darker tendencies became hard to ignore. By the time he was 15 in 1976, Ronald decided to rob a local store, a place kind of like a pawn shop. He didn't just want to steal a few things, though. He went for the big ticket items. He stole firearms, watches, and a bunch of ammunition. And get this, he didn't hide it. He actually brought the guns and ammo to school, showing them off like they were trophies. There was something unsettling about a 15-year-old kid talking about how he was ready to use those weapons, hinting to his classmates that he wasn't afraid of anything. It's like he wanted to be seen. He wanted to be someone to be feared, someone who wasn't bound by the same rules as everyone else. And that kind of attitude is dangerous in a kid who's already showing signs of being manipulative and devious. Then came the day that changed everything. April 12th, 1976. Ronald showed up to school armed with a gun. In front of a crowd of students, he shot and killed 15-year-old Lorenzo Nealand, hitting him in the chest and abdomen. He didn't stop there. He shot another classmate, James Christian, who, by some miracle, survived. There's still some mystery around why Ronald did it. Some say it was over a dispute involving a girl. Some reports and others say that there had been some tension building for weeks, even rumors of a previous burglary. But whatever the reason, Ronald didn't hesitate. He acted with a kind of coldness that you just don't expect from a teenager. After the shooting, Ronald didn't try to run and hide. He was found walking along Old Mansfield Road, still carrying the weapon. It was like he didn't care if he got caught. Maybe he thought he was invincible, or maybe he just didn't see a way out anymore. When the authorities finally got a hold of him, they had him evaluated and diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. It was a shock to his family, who had always thought of him as a troubled kid, but not someone who was actually mentally ill. So following his arrest, Ronald was sentenced to 10 years in the Texas Department of Corrections for Lorenzo's murder. He was just a teenager, locked up for a crime that many adults would struggle to understand. His parents visited him. They tried to keep the family bond strong, but it was clear that Ronald's path had already taken a drastic turn. In 1983, after serving about 7 years, he was released early. No parole, no probation, just set loose back into the world. And unfortunately, it didn't take long for him to slip back up into his old ways. After Ronald got out of prison, Ronald tried to keep it together, or at least on the surface. He found a job at a restaurant just to make ends meet, but he wasn't the type to stick to a steady job. By the late 1984, he already been fired for being late too often. And once he lost that job, it was like all the progress he'd made, if you could even call it that, just crumbled away. He started drifting back towards crime, and it wasn't long before his brother James followed him. Now this is where I draw some similarities to this case, because I too have a brother, and me and him, we're as thick as thieves. We do a lot of the same things. We're very one and the same. A lot of people say that we're very similar. And just to see how similar we are to the Allridge brothers is kind of a stark reality, because what if I went down this path and my brother followed me? Who knows? We both came from a home that it was filled with love for the most part, and we had both our parents, and who knows where we could have been today. So the first major incident came on January 13th, 1985. It was a late night, around 11:30 p.m., when a 911 call was made from a Krusty's Pizza in Southwest Fort Worth. An employee returning from a pizza delivery had found the manager, Buddy Joe Webster, dead inside the restaurant. When the police arrived, they noticed a man standing outside, still wearing a Krusty's uniform, looking completely bewildered. It was like he was in shock. But when they walked inside, they discovered the real horror. Buddy Joe Webster had been shot in the head. The scene was grim, and the senselessness of the crime shook everyone involved. And just a few weeks later, the Allridge brothers struck again, this time at a Circle K. James had once worked there, and he knew how to access a safe. He went inside under the pretense of needing change to make a phone call. Brian Clendenin, who was only 21, was working that night. When James came in, Brian didn't think anything of it. He even let James in, probably thinking he was just an old coworker stopping by. But what Brian didn't know was that James had planned this, and Ronald was waiting outside. Now, after leaving for a moment, James came back inside, but this time wasn't friendly. He pulled out a .25 caliber pistol, and he forced Brian into the storeroom. He tied him up with the electrical cord. He looted the cash register before shooting Brian twice in the head, execution style. Ronald had told him to make sure there were no witnesses, and James followed through. This is one of the most heart-wrenching parts of the story. Brian's mother, Doris, arrived at the store just minutes later to pick him up. She found loose change on the floor and knew something was terribly wrong. But Brian died the next day. Now, just going to take a quick minute. After I came and did the research, and I found that his mother had actually gotten there earlier, and when James went back to the car and his brother told him not to leave any witnesses, he goes back in, but he notices that there was a woman in a car in the parking lot, and that's what caused him not to go back. But this is after the fact that he shot him, and that just is crazy to me, because his mother was there while her son was getting executed, and it's unfathomable to think of what she thought of when she went into the restaurant. But now we fast forward to February 7th, 1985. After the Circle K murder, the Allridge brothers continued their crime spree. On February 7th, they robbed a Pizza Hut while wearing ski masks. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a series of robberies that spread fear across the whole area. Over the next month, police connected at least 10 robberies to the brothers. Each time the methods were similar, and the level of violence kept escalating. Now, the spree came to a tragic end on March 25th, when Ronald, armed with a shotgun, stormed into a Whataburger and shot a 19-year-old Carla Otto, a customer who had been dining there. She was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was the final act of a months-long string of violence, and it was the crime that finally connected Ronald and James to the other murders. Now, there was an interview done where they were talking about the murder of the 19-year-old, and she was actually sitting there eating when they all came in, and he actually goes up to her, and he says, "Put everything in the bag, bitch." And by the time she raises her hands, he shoots her point blank. Just the malice behind this man is just unreal. Now, the law enforcement, they had been monitoring the Allridge brothers for some time, and it wasn't long before their efforts paid off. The surveillance of Ronald's apartment led officers to James' vehicle, where they spotted a shotgun in plain sight. The discovery gave them probable cause they needed to issue warrants. Now, the law regarding open site searches is the same as if anything in the public view is considered non-private. So if your windows to your home, somebody can stand on the sidewalk and look into your house and be fully legally covered because that's public view. What the officer did was he walked up to the car, he looked into the car without opening the door, and he noticed that there was a shotgun in the front passenger seat. Thus, he didn't need a search warrant or anything of that matter. And with that being said, they were able to secure search warrants and arrest warrants for both the brothers, and along with their associates, Clarence and Milton Jarman. Once in custody, Ronald didn't hold back. He confessed to 13 armed robberies and admitted to murdering Buddy Joe Webster. James followed suit, acknowledging his role in the Circle K murder and detailing how Ronald had pushed him to make sure there were no loose ends. These confessions left no doubt that their involvement in the string of crimes. Now, during Ronald's trial, the prosecution laid out the history and the violence of the criminal behavior, including the murder of Lorenzo Nealon back in 1976. They argued that Ronald's past showed a pattern of escalating brutality that left little hope for rehabilitation. Despite his defense attempts to claim that Carla Otto's murder was unintentional, the jury didn't buy it. Ronald was sentenced to death. Now, to note, a little more substance of what happened in her murder. Now, when one of the Jarman brothers was diving over the counter, he dropped his gun. It fell loose, and it discharged upon impact to the ground. Now, he's saying that when that gun went off, it startled him, and he ended up pulling the trigger on his shotgun and killing Otto. Now, some say that he had a hair trigger on his shotgun, but both defense and prosecutors, they had firearm specialists come in and testify and gave definitions of what a hair trigger was, and the court record showed that, it took 4 pounds to pull the trigger. It's not considered a hair trigger on the shotgun, and that he was just basically lying at that point. Now, at James's trial, James's team tried to paint him as a victim of his older brother's manipulation. They argue that he had been led astray by Ronald's influence, and that without his brother's pressure, he might never have committed such heinous acts. But the jury wasn't moved whatsoever. James had been involved in multiple armed robberies and had taken Brian Clennan's life. He too was sentenced to death. And to note, in both of these trials, the time it took for the jury to come back was less than 5 hours on both cases. And they were 2 separate trials, 2 separate juries, and they both came back within a short amount of time with the death sentence. So Ronald's first up, and Ronald met his end on June 8th, 1995. When given the chance to speak his last words, he declined. It was as if he had nothing left to say, facing his execution with the same coldness that marked his whole entire life. He also didn't choose a final meal. Now, James's execution, his final moments were different. He exposed remorse and gratitude to his family in his last words. His last words were, "To the moon and back, I love you all." His last meal reflected a longing for simpler pleasures. He had a double bacon cheeseburger, crinkle cut fries, banana pudding, and watermelon. As the lethal injection was administered, there were a sense of closure for the families of his victims, but the loss and pain remained. Now, when you look at the story of Ronald and James Allridge, it's hard not to think about the psychological dynamics that were at play. Ronald's diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia is a crucial detail, especially considering how untreated mental illness can exacerbate violent tendencies. His behavior didn't emerge out of nowhere. There were signs early, very early on, that he struggled with anger, impulse control, and skewed perception of reality. The fact that these issues weren't largely under-addressed in any meaningful way probably contributed to the escalation of his criminal behavior. But it wasn't just about Ronald's mental illness. There were also the manipulation and the control he exerted over his younger brother. In cases like this, it's not uncommon to see one sibling taking on a dominant role, influencing the other to participate in acts that might not have committed on their own moral compass. This kind of toxic bond can blur the lines between victim and perpetuator, leaving us to wonder how much agency James really had in these crimes. Now, the Allridge's case is very tragic. It's a very tragic illustration of how family bonds can sometimes work against individuals rather than support them. There's this idea that family loyalty is inherently good, but in the case, it became a weapon that Ronald used to pull James into his world of violence. It's heartbreaking to think about how different their lives might have been if James had found the strength to break away from his brother's influence. What if he had someone else to look up to, like his father, or someone who could have steered him in a different direction? Now, this case also raises important questions about criminal justice system and its handling of individuals with mental health issues. Ronald's initial incarceration after the murder of Lorenzo Nealon didn't involve any serious attempt at rehabilitation or treatment for his diagnosed schizophrenia. He served his time and was released early without any kind of monitoring or mental health support that someone with his history would likely need. It's a reminder that our system often focuses on punishment over prevention. They are more reaction than proaction. Locking people up without addressing the root cause of their behavior. Would things have turned out differently if Ronald had received appropriate mental health treatment while incarcerated? It's impossible to say for sure, but it's a question worth asking. Now, even though Ronald and James grew up in a loving home, that doesn't mean they were free from trauma. Ronald's early violent behavior, the frequent relocations due to their family's military career, and the transition from a disciplinary military lifestyle to a civilian life may have contributed to a sense of displacement. For Ronald, there was likely a struggle to find a sense of identity and control. For James, the trauma may have come from the fear of manipulation he experienced under his brother's influence. Just because trauma isn't immediately visible doesn't mean it isn't there. The question then becomes, how do we better recognize and address these hidden wounds before they manifest in tragic ways? Another point worth considering is the role of capital punishment in this case. Both brothers were sentenced to death, which raises a broader question about whether the death penalty is truly the best form of justice for cases involving mental health and manipulation. There's an argument to be made that people like Ronald, who had documented mental health issues, might be more in need of lifelong treatment than execution. On the other hand, there's the reality that families of the victims deserve justice and closure. It's a debate that doesn't have a straightforward answer, but it's one that in this case brings to the forefront. Ultimately, the story of Ronald and James Allridge is more than just a case study of two brothers who committed horrible crimes. It's a reflection of a systematic issues of our society, how mental health is treated, and how criminal justice system just often fails to provide adequate rehabilitation, and how family dynamics can be far more complex than they appear. For me, the takeaway is that there are so many opportunities for intervention that were missed here. It's not just about what the brothers did, but about what could have been done to prevent it. Now, what if Ronald had received more comprehensive mental health treatment during his initial incarceration? What if James had found someone outside of his family who could have been a positive influence, offering him a way out of his brother's shadow? These are the kind of questions that linger long after you've finished hearing the details of the case. They remind us that justice system doesn't just deal with criminals, it deals with human beings, many of whom have complex backgrounds that need to be considered if we ever hope to break the cycle of violence. But it's difficult not to wonder how different things could have played out. Could the murders been prevented if Ronald's early warning signs had been addressed more aggressively? What about James? If he didn't been exposed to Ronald's criminal influence, could he have lived a normal life? These questions highlight the unpredictability of human behavior, but they also underscore the importance of intervention, support, and early detection of risk factors. In hindsight, it's easy to say more could have been done, but it's a reminder that we do see the signs, we have to take them seriously, and we need the resources in place to do something about them. There's also a larger conversation here about how communities respond to troubled individuals. When Ronald brought guns to school and displayed violent behavior at such a young age, it was a huge red flag. But the community responses didn't go beyond what was legally required. They treated the symptoms without really addressing the cause. It makes you think about what role society should play in providing support and preventing tragedies like these. When we talk about public safety, it's not just about catching criminals. It's about understanding why they became criminals in the first place. Finally, let's not forget the moral and ethical dilemmas that cases like this present. The story of Ronald and James forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about justice, mental illness, family loyalty, and punishment. Is justice truly served when someone with a severe mental disorder is executed? What do we do when someone's worst actions are tied to their deepest vulnerabilities? These questions that don't come with easy answers, they're crucial if we ever hope to make sense of tragedies like this one and learn to prevent them in the future. Now, as we wrap up the episode, I just want to thank all of you guys for listening, and thank you for joining me on this episode of Dre's Crime Chronicles. I know this was a heavy one. I hope it's giving you something to think about, and it's not just about the Allridge brothers, but it's about the system we rely on to protect us and the challenges we face doing so effectively. If you found this episode thought-provoking, I'd love for you to share your thoughts and continue the conversation. What do you think about the balance between punishment and rehabilitation, especially in the case involving around mental illness? Are there better ways we can intervene to prevent tragedies like this from happening? Make sure to follow and subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. We'll continue to dive deep into these complex stories and explore the dark corners of the human behavior. Until then, stay safe, be kind to one another, and always remember, there's more to every story than appears on the surface. God bless.